Thank you, brother. Appreciate you, Adrian. And I want to take a moment to thank Rupa and Berkeley Life for hosting this event. I always love the opportunity to share some of my education with providers. Clinical education research is my jam. And so it's really a great honor to have the opportunity to share some of this information with you. So let's go ahead and get started because I do have quite a bit of material that I want to cover in the time. So we'll try to keep it to about 45 minutes. I have my timer going so I can keep track here. I will say that this slide deck is pretty dense. And as Adrian already said, he's going to give you guys access to the slide deck so you can read along. And I really want this deck to be a great reference tool that you can use as soon as you get back to your practice. So I hope to make this worth your while. Now, with me, everything that I do, my whole career really centers around metabolic and mental health and teaching a functional medicine root cause to both. And certainly, as I will elucidate throughout this presentation, I would really argue that if we're trying to combat the mental health crisis, it really starts with the metabolic crisis. And certainly, it's really a privilege to have the opportunity to work with Berkeley to help them with their research and clinical education, because we are absolutely advancing the science and research and testing and therapeutics of the miracle molecule nitric oxide, which is a subject I never get tired of talking about. My personal background is fitness and nutrition, and in that world, nitric oxide has embraced for decades as an ergogenic aid. The narrative has always been train longer, train harder, recover faster by promoting optimal blood flow through vasodilation of nitric oxide. But we're going to take it to a different level today in looking at the convergence of some of my favorite subjects with methylation and MTHFR, with how hot that is right now and how mainstream it's getting. And of course, nitric oxide, and the role of the garden of life, that enchanting microbiome of both the oral cavity and the gastrointestinal tract. So buckle up and let's dive in here. If you don't know anything about me or my work, you can take a little overview, but I want to talk about myself. I want to talk about this really, really cool science. Throughout this presentation, what I hope to accomplish is to help you all gain some familiarity around some of these critical concepts, such as glial activation, or specifically microglial activations. We're talking about neuroimmunology and neuroinflammation, methylation and one-carbon metabolism, nitric oxide, and very importantly, nitric oxide synthase uncoupling that I'll define as we go. The nitrate pathway, which is what Berkeley Life is all about, with leveraging this primordial nitrate pathway to supply the body with adequate nitric oxide all the time, and how the role of the oral and gut microbiota heavily influences all of this. So we're going to look at the overlap of these mechanisms. Now, this lecture could honestly be a 20-hour course, so we're going to try to pack it all together, and I want to give you guys as many clinical pearls and fill your functional toolbox as much as possible. So I won't spend too much time on statistics because I think we can all appreciate the chronic disease crisis that we're up against, with 6 in 10 Americans having a chronic disease, 4 in 10 having 2 or more. We see the top 10 leading causes of death. Obviously, cardiovascular disease is number 1, but I want to make note that cerebrovascular disease is number 5. Of course, Alzheimer's, diabetes up there, suicide being a leading cause of death for young people. I personally have my whole sort of backstory and sad story of how I got into specializing with functional medicine for mental health myself. So it's a subject I'm very, very passionate about, near and dear to my heart. Now, of course, though, as I acknowledge, we have to recognize that 70% of the American population is overweight. 88% of the American population is considered metabolically compromised. So being more of a fitness, nutrition, metabolic physiology background myself, I love seeing metabolic physiology starting to become a little bit more mainstream within the functional space. Muscle as medicine, movement as medicine, nutrition as medicine, so on and so forth. Now, as basic as it might seem to most of us, I think all too often in the functional medicine space, we're really good at overcomplicating things. And we have to bring it back to the foundations of health and recognizing that suboptimal blood flow is implicated in virtually every chronic disease. So this is obviously, of course, with cardiovascular, we all know that nitric oxide won the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1998 for its role as a pleiotropic, multifaceted signaling molecule within the cardiometabolic system. Now, nitric oxide does so much more than that, but this is also why I wanted to make note of cerebrovascular disease, right? stroke in particular as the 5th leading cause of death for Americans, more so than Alzheimer's, right? Everybody's talking about Alzheimer's, type 3 diabetes. I think it's quite a bit more than that. But blood flow to the brain is one of the most foundational aspects to combat the mental health crisis. A hypoxic brain is more oxidative stress, more inflammation, more leaky brain, more demyelination, and impaired bioenergetics. So we have to acknowledge that optimal blood flow is the foundation of all wellness and all healing. We have to be able to get oxygen, nutrients, hormones, immune cells, everything to the target tissues, right? If we have any kind of compromised blood flow and atherosclerosis, any kind of vascular disease, this is going to dramatically impair our ability to heal that tissue, heal that organ system, so on and so forth. So these are some great notes. Of course, I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading the slides directly. You can look through the slides on your own. There's a lot of really good Cliff Notes education in here. But as I was just saying, these are some of the mechanisms by which compromised blood flow to the brain can dramatically impair bioenergetics and cause this microglial activated phenotype that then might present as depression or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, so on and so forth, right? So we have to be thinking, how can we optimize blood flow and perfusion to the brain, to the organs, to the entire body? And this is, of course, where the molecule of life, nitric oxide, comes into play, right? Nitric oxide being a diatomic molecule, 1 nitrogen, 1 oxygen, covalent bond, absolutely essential for optimizing vasodilation, allowing the smooth muscles to relax within our blood vessels. So we have that expanded diameter, adequate blood flow and perfusion. But nitric oxide is so much more. It's a critical molecule for the immune system. Many of our immune cells, particularly macrophages, will express inducible nitric oxide synthase and create high quantities of nitric oxide gas as an antimicrobial molecule to fight off foreign invaders and infections. So nitric oxide is deeply implicated in the immunological response, the inflammatory response to combat infection. So certainly there's a whole conversation we could have around Lyme and COVID and all sorts of things. Also regulating mitochondrial oxygen consumption, super cool mechanisms by which nitric oxide can essentially slow down oxidative phosphorylation under hypoxic conditions as a way to conserve energy while at the same time increasing blood flow so we can reoxygenate the tissues. So mitochondrial health being deeply involved in both metabolic and mental health disorders, and nitric oxide being a critical regulator of mitochondrial activity, and so much more. So as we look into this, I really wanted to make a statement with this slide. And essentially what I was looking at here is looking at the role of nitric oxide in all of the leading causes of death for Americans. So we can very confidently say that nitric oxide dysregulation is implicated in all chronic disease here. The only one I couldn't find much connection to was unintentional injuries or accidents. Some papers came up about nitrous oxide, N2O, laughing gas, not to be confused with nitric oxide. That second nitrogen makes a very big difference. But I truly never get tired of talking about nitric oxide. It's a deep rabbit hole. There can be a lot of nuance to it, but context matters. And that's why I love being the director of clinical education for Berkeley, because it's my job to equip practitioners with the education, the tools, the research, the testing, their therapeutics, so they can restore optimal nitric oxide signaling in all of their clients and patients. So certainly as we age, because of inflammaging and immunosenescence, we do lose a lot of our nitric oxide producing capacity. It's estimated that by the time we reach 40 years of age, we're already at about 50% nitric oxide capacity within the endothelium. So of course, then atherosclerosis, heart disease risk can increase. And there's a big conversation we should be having, especially around women's health with perimenopause and postmenopause, and certainly andropause as well. But especially for women, when women are entering peri and postmenopause and their estrogen crashes out, that estrogen is a very potent stimulator of endothelial nitric oxide synthase. Heart disease risk goes up and up and up through peri and postmenopause. So it's really the heart disease that is unfortunately taking the lives of a lot of women. And nitric oxide is really the critical molecule here that is becoming compromised as the sex hormones, particularly estrogen, go offline, right? So I would argue, candidly, that in a lot of ways, nitric oxide is the longevity molecule. It is the anti-aging molecule. The trick to anti-aging is to keep inflammation and oxidative stress at bay for as long as possible. And nitric oxide is a pleiotropic gas throughout the entire body, has a profound impact on regulating redox homeostasis as well as keeping inflammation in check, right? So I would presume that the vast majority of you are seeing signs and symptoms related to compromised nitric oxide in all of your patients and clients, whether it's the low energy and chronic fatigue, the brain fog, the peripheral neuropathy, so on and so forth. And of course, hypertension. We see that about 70 to 75% of Americans will experience hypertension at some point in their life cycle. And most individuals with hypertension don't effectively have it under control. And of course, nitric oxide is really best known for its ability to reduce blood pressure by promoting vasodilation. So we do have a gold standard clinical study that Berkeley did, double-blind placebo-controlled trial. I have that later in the slides, but we did see a 12.5 point systolic reduction in blood pressure in the cohort of participants for that study over the course of 90 days using the Berkeley Life Nitric Oxide Foundation product with no other lifestyle interventions or medications. I do have some slides for that research study, and you can read the full paper itself. It's a beautiful and very well done study. And we're very proud of being a research-based company at Berkeley Life. So with this conversation, I want to focus on some of these core areas of nitric oxide signaling. Of course, we all think of cardiovascular, cardiometabolic, blood flow, vasodilation. I like to say that if you have a pulse, nitric oxide is for you, right? So we're going to hone in a little bit on the neurological, cardiometabolic, gastric, and methylation and epigenetic health because it's really fun. So a couple slides here looking at some of the pertinent mechanisms that we're going to explore today. So of course, beyond just blood pressure and endothelial function, we can be thinking about the role of nitric oxide to regulate oxidative stress and inflammation that really drives all chronic disease, but also some lesser known mechanisms of nitric oxide, such as helping to restore insulin sensitivity and glucose disposal, specifically by activating the GLUT4 transporter, as well as supporting things like vagal tone and vagal signaling, as we're going to get into with our gut-brain axis type conversation here. And especially with neuroimmunology as my favorite area to study, especially microglial activation, nitric oxide is deeply involved in the central nervous system. For example, nitric oxide is absolutely required for cerebral blood flow and also glymphatic activity. So we can actually use the glymphatic system to clear out neurotoxins and tau proteins and amyloid beta as one mechanism, as a clinical pearl that some of you might appreciate. Those aquaporin 4 protein channels that are expressed by astrocyte end feet that wrap around our blood-brain barrier, the aquaporin 4 protein expression is actually regulated by nitric oxide. Without a healthy lymphatic system, we can't really clear the brain of debris and neurotoxins. And as we'll get into, nitric oxide plays a critical role in neural stem cell maturation, neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, so we can rewire and regenerate the brain in our neural circuitry, as well as acting as a retrograde gasotransmitter and modulating the release of a lot of our feel-good neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and acetylcholine, so on and so forth. So many mechanisms by which nitric oxide is critical for maintaining a healthy central nervous system and brain. So a little bit of a primer here, nitric oxide biochemistry 101, and then we're going to take it more in depth, don't worry. But to start out, just so we're all on the same page here, most practitioners that are familiar with nitric oxide are more familiar with the classic L-arginine pathway, or more specifically, the nitric oxide synthase pathway, right? This is our innate, endogenous, enzyme-driven way to manufacture this nitric oxide gas. It's a gas that has a half-life of about 3 milliseconds in the blood. So as soon as it's produced, it can easily diffuse through tissues and exert its pleiotropic signaling effects, and it will very quickly get oxidized into nitrite or then further oxidized into nitrate. So at a very basic level, you can think of nitrate as the storage form of nitric oxide. And the whole point is we can reduce nitrate into nitrite and then further into nitric oxide. So circulating levels of plasma nitrate and nitrite is really the best way to get a feel for nitric oxide status. Now, with the L-arginine pathway, classically, most nutraceuticals or supplements that are nitric oxide boosting are using L-arginine, citrulline, and different cofactors. Now, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with the nitric oxide synthase pathway, as I'll illustrate comprehensively momentarily. But what I really want to highlight here is this nitrate pathway, right? So we can get dietary nitrate from, of course, our nutrition and supplementation. At Berkeley Life, we are leveraging this primordial nitrate pathway because emerging evidence in a rapidly growing body of evidence would really postulate that this seems to be our primary pathway to have adequate nitric oxide signaling all the time. So dietary nitrate is primarily coming from our dark green leafy things, our kale, our spinach, our bok choy, arugula, celery, so on and so forth. Of course, beets. Beets have become this superfood and this blood flow, blood pressure type food. The reason why is beets just so happen to be higher in dietary nitrate, or NO3 minus, right? So the Berkeley product, the Nitric Oxide Foundation, leverages this nitrate pathway by supplying a therapeutic dose, specifically 314 milligrams of dietary nitrate per a 2-capsule serving. Now, nitrate can be reduced into nitrite, NO2 minus, or then further reduced into nitric oxide as needed. And we have a number of pathways and mechanisms by which we can reduce nitrate. It all starts with the oral microbiota. So we actually concentrate nitrate in the salivary gland. So we have 10 times the concentration of nitrate in the salivary gland compared to circulating in the plasma, which is why using salivary testing with the salivary nitrite test strips is really a superior way to test for nitric oxide status, because we're looking at this highly concentrated nitrate in the salivary gland. And then as that saliva is interjected into the oral cavity, assuming, and that's a big assumption, and we'll talk about it more, but if we have an adequate oral microbiota and adequate levels of nitrate-reducing bacterial species within the oral microbiome, we can effectively reduce that nitrate from the saliva into nitrite, which is what the test strips are measuring. And this is a very versatile clinical tool. Of course, look, I'm a lab testing guy, I'm a biomarker guy, but how often can we do lab testing? Like every, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, if we're fortunate and lucky. But having a non-invasive, at-home, in-clinic test strip that we can, within seconds, see how pink is their test strip, how sufficient is their nitrate and nitrite status, right? So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this and see how the oral microbiome, the acidic stomach environment, and the gastrointestinal microbiome have a major role in regulating nitric oxide status throughout the body, right? So before we get too deep into methylation, microbiome, all this cool stuff, I want to familiarize us with the Berkeley product line. We have this total nitric oxide solution system. So as I just described, we start with the salivary nitrite test strips, and this is really looking at the ability of the oral microbiota in able to convert the nitrate from the saliva into nitrite, right? So we're testing for that conversion with the test strips, and then we're using the dietary nitrate Nitric Oxide Foundation products to supply the body with adequate levels of nitrate with a therapeutic dose. Because think of it like an amino acid pool, right? We have to consume adequate protein every day to make sure we have enough circulating amino acids so we can manufacture enzymes and proteins and build muscle and all the things. Think of the nitrate pool or this nitrate reservoir. Our job is to fill that nitrate reservoir, whether it's with green juice or dark green leafy salad or the nitrate supplementation, to make sure we have adequate circulating nitrate so we can manufacture nitric oxide as needed. Now, this past winter at A4M, we launched our new nitrate prebiotic-like gum, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but one of the clinical pearls here is that dietary nitrate has a prebiotic-like effect, right? So if we swallow capsules of nitrate, that could have a prebiotic effect in the gastrointestinal microbiota, but we intentionally made the gum matrix and packing the potassium nitrate as the main source of nitrate into a gum matrix So that way you can chew on it, you can chomp on it, and marinate those oral microbiota in these prebiotic nitrates so we can increase the level of nitrate-reducing bacterial species locally within the oral microbiome. There's a lot of really, really exciting research coming out about the oral microbiome and leaky gums and all of these cool things. And what we see is how compromised oral health can directly impact blood pressure, heart disease, cardiometabolic health, and even mental health. And really, the nitric oxide mechanism is the main thing going on there. So if we have a dysbiotic and leaky gum type situation with more endotoxin translocation driving inflammation in the body or the brain, and we have a lack of nitrate-reducing bacterial species, our nitric oxide gets offline, we have more inflammation systemically, so it can increase risk of heart disease and chronic disease and neuroinflammatory disease, so on and so forth. So now that we have a basic familiarity with our core products, I'll sprinkle these in of how and when do we use these things. So some of you are like, hey, when are we going to talk about methylation in the microbiome? So we're just getting warmed up. So I wanted to start with the more basic nitrate pathway before I confuse anybody too much, but this is my more comprehensive graphic for the nitric oxide synthase pathway on the left and the nitrate pathway on the right. So we're going to take this a little bit more in depth. So some of the major biological effects of nitric oxide, of course, the vasodilation, perfusion, but also neuroendocrine regulation, neurotransmission, immune function, neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, also lymphatic drainage. Lymphatic drainage has become a really hot subject in the functional medicine space, all about lymph drainage. And guess what? Your lymphatic vessels are lined with endothelial cells that express endothelial nitric oxide synthase. What do you think regulates the vasodilation of the lymphatic vessels? Nitric oxide, right? Redox homeostasis, as I alluded to, certainly that oxidation reduction biochemistry. Are we in a state of oxidative and nitrosative stress, or are we in a state of redox homeostasis? Nitric oxide is the key molecule that regulates that, helping to regulate the inflammatory response throughout the body, blood sugar signaling, so on and so forth. So this is where I want to illustrate what can go wrong with the nitric oxide synthase pathway. I already showed how as we age, we lose some of our nitric oxide synthase capacity, especially in the endothelium, right? Now, a few things here. From the top, especially as we get into methylation and genetics, epigenetics, single nucleotide polymorphisms. There are known clinically significant single nucleotide polymorphisms for all three of the NOS isoforms. NOS1, which is neuronal nitric oxide synthase, as the name implies, primarily expressed by neurons, but other cells as well. NOS2, which is our inducible nitric oxide synthase. This is our isoform of nitric oxide that is going to produce much higher quantities of nitric oxide to fight off foreign invaders and infection as part of the immune response and inflammatory response. Then NOS3, or endothelial nitric oxide synthase. This is the one that kind of gets all the press because this is blood flow, endothelial function, cardiometabolic function. So I do have a slide that you guys can refer to. Any of you that are using genetic testing or assessing SNPs in your clients and patients, these are some of the major SNPs that have been identified so far, right? They're discovering new SNPs all the time. There's about 20 to 25,000 protein coding genes in the human genome. But to date, there's over 88 million SNPs that have been identified. How many SNPs does your favorite genetic test assess? 200, 300? Because there's 88 million known, right? So anyways, we could go deep into SNP analysis. But some of these SNPs that I just showed on that slide do cause dysregulation of the NOS enzyme. So further, we also have to have adequate levels of cofactors to facilitate this enzyme-driven conversion of L-arginine as the nitrogen source into our miracle molecule nitric oxide. So the major cofactors, molecular oxygen, biopterin or BH4. This is part where methylation comes into play, as I'll elucidate momentarily. NADPH from the pentose phosphate pathway, flavin mononucleotide, FAD from riboflavin with the help of T4 to convert it to FAD, magnesium, heme iron, and glutathione. Some of you that know a thing or two about methylation know that both biopterin and glutathione are deeply connected to methylation, transsulfuration, and the biopterin pathway, as I'm going to explain further. Now, one of the major things I want to highlight here is nitric oxide synthase uncoupling. I'm sure some of you already know what that is, and that's great. Good for you guys. For those of you less familiar, nitric oxide synthase uncoupling refers to a dysregulation of the nitric oxide synthase enzyme. And what happens is instead of producing nitric oxide, this uncoupled NOS enzyme is producing superoxide radicals. Now, superoxide can further react with nitric oxide to create an even nastier radical called peroxynitrite that can drive a lot of oxidative nitrosative stress and even DNA damage, right? So the problem with this nitric oxide synthase pathway, for one thing, it starts shutting down as we get older and older through inflammation and immunosenescence. But if we have lack of cofactors or maybe hypoxia or some single nucleotide polymorphisms, elevated oxidative stress and inflammation, all of these factors will contribute to a greater degree of NOS uncoupling. So think about this. If you're pumping an L-arginine-based or L-citrulline-based nutraceutical product into somebody that has chronic disease, let's say they're 45, they have maybe some kind of heart disease or diabetes, metabolic syndrome, major depressive disorder, chronic fatigue, fatty liver, all the things, right? It is very, very, very likely that they have a high level of NOS uncoupling. If you pump L-arginine or citrulline into that uncoupled NOS, you're just going to get more superoxide and peroxynitrite that then could make things worse. It can add more oxidative and nitrosative stress, more inflammation, right? So an arginine or citrulline-based product could, in fact, make the situation worse. Look, as a younger guy, I'm young, I'm fit, I'm metabolically active, I've been an athlete forever, and with my background with nutrition fitness, I would really argue that the only demographic that's really going to benefit from an arginine or citrulline-based product is younger, metabolically active, fit individuals, like young athletes. But we can circumvent all of this dysfunction by going with a nitrate-based nitric oxide nutraceutical, such as the Nitric Oxide Foundation product from Berkeley. So we're leveraging the nitrate pathway, which is primarily regulated by the oral microbiome, the acidic stomach environment, and the gastrointestinal microbiome. So we have these nitrate-reducing bacterial species, or we should, within the oral microbiome and the gut microbiome, and also the acidic stomach environment. However, if we have poor oral hygiene or hypochlorhydria, H. pylori, taking antacids, PPIs, gut microbiome dysbiosis, so on and so forth, we may not be able to effectively reduce our dietary nitrate into nitrite or further into nitric oxide. Now, scientists and researchers were discovering new mechanisms of nitrate reduction constantly. So clinical pearl xanthine oxioreductase, same enzyme that facilitates the uric acid pathway. So this is an enzyme that can actually help contribute to nitrate homeostasis and reducing nitrate, nitrite, or even some of our electron transport chain complexes can help facilitate reduction or oxidation as well, or aldehyde oxidase. Now, interestingly, and not surprisingly to me, is skeletal muscle has been identified as a major source of nitrate storage, right? So the more muscle you have, the more nitrate you can store, and other things like creatine and glycogen, all sorts of things. Now, as I mentioned previously, this is a redox flux going on here. So you have this NO3 nitrate. This is the most stable molecule. It has a half-life of hours up to days. It's much more stable than nitrite. So it's the predominant circulating form, the storage form of nitric oxide, right? Nitrite has a shorter half-life, about 45 minutes, maybe hours, depending on the text that you read. And of course, it depends on the individual. But then once we reduce into nitric oxide, it's only going to have that half-life of a few milliseconds before it gets oxidized back into nitrite or then nitrate. And we circulate this throughout the body. So storing that nitrate in the salivary gland and then swallowing that nitrate or nitrite-rich saliva down into the acidic gut and then the intestinal microbiota, this is a mechanism by which we can recycle nitrate throughout the body. Because, hey, if we're in a sort of primal hunter-gatherer type perspective here, we might not be able to eat dark green leafy things or beets all the time. So we have to have a way that we can recirculate and recycle our precious nitrate so we can use that nitric oxide as needed. So this is a little bit of a more comprehensive breakdown on the biochemistry here. So now we're going to layer in methylation and the microbiome and all these cool things. So again, you can refer to those SNPs for those of you that are assessing SNP risk. But let's get into methylation and the microbiome and how all of these things converge a little bit. So I love methylation, and MTHFR is getting bigger and bigger, much more mainstream. So we have a lot of clients and patients that are freaking out about, oh my gosh, I have the dreaded 677 homozygous. What do I do? What supplement do I take? And of course, we should be basing supplement recommendations off physiological biochemical biomarkers, not SNPs, right? We have to base it on the current state of methylation using clinically established biomarkers, such as homocysteine being the gold standard. Now, we see that about 1 in 3 Americans have some kind of deleterious MTHFR variant. And what I find interesting about this MTHFR conversation is most people are only assessing and talking about the 677 and 1298 SNPs. In reality, there's over 14 clinically significant MTHFR polymorphisms. So there's another 12 that people are not thinking about, talking about, testing, so on and so forth, right? So SNP hunting can lead us astray sometimes. But methylation is so critical for so many different functions in the body, as we're about to get into. And it's heavily associated with a lot of different chronic diseases, as well as neurological, neurodevelopmental, neurodegenerative conditions, which is a big area of passion for me. So a good comprehensive list here of some of the major conditions that is linked and associated with methylation defects. So with key functions of methylation, we don't have time to get into all the key functions, but of course, I really want to hone in on the nitric oxide production piece here. Of course, neurotransmitter metabolism, hormone metabolism, creatine, carnitine, CoQ10, the list goes on, right? But let's hone in a little bit on this nitric oxide piece, because this is really interesting. I'll just say it now, individuals with a more naughty MTHFR, and it might not be MTHFR, it could be MTR, MAT, BHMT, CBS. There's a lot of other genes and enzymes and SNPs that could cause methylation dysfunction beyond just MTHFR. But if somebody has some of these SNPs or predispositions or inhibitions to their methylation biochemistry, it can very dramatically impact nitric oxide status. As I previously alluded to, that biopterin or BH4 is a major cofactor for the nitric oxide synthase pathway, as well as glutathione, which is the major chief antioxidant of the body and a major product of the transsulfuration pathway. So we're able to convert homocysteine into cystathionine, into cysteine, and ultimately glutathione as needed, assuming our biochemistry is working properly. Now, a lot of people don't know about some of this biochemistry, but homocysteine has an inverse relationship with biopterin or BH4. So as homocysteine is going up and up and up, and they might have hyperhomocystinemia or homocystinuria, not the same thing, but similar, but high levels of homocysteine really could be used as a proxy marker for deficient biopterin or BH4. Now, we need adequate biopterin to produce nitric oxide, to produce serotonin, dopamine, tyrosine from phenylalanine. So clinical pearl, as you see homocysteine creeping up and up and up, 9, 10, 12, 15, it's going to compromise their biopterin and ability to produce nitric oxide and some of their feel-good neurotransmitters. This rate-limiting enzyme, guanosine triphosphate cyclohydrolase 1, it's a mouthful, but GTPCH1. This pathway is primarily expressed by immune cells like macrophages in the periphery and microglial cells, my favorite cell of the human body within the central nervous system. And when this enzyme gets stimulated by pro-inflammatory stimuli, it'll increase the production of this neopterin molecule at the expense of our biopterin, right? So neopterin is a biomarker. You can measure it in the urine, the blood, the cerebrospinal fluid, and it's directly reflective of macrophage activation, microglial activation, immune activation in general, right? The immune system is ticked off and it's activating, and we have this M1 polarization of our macrophages and microglial cells, right? So if you're measuring neopterin and homocysteine in the blood, as you see increasing neopterin above about 2.0 is a good functional range to use, or maybe 1.5 if you want to be picky, and then homocysteine creeping up, 10, 12, 15, so on and so forth, we can safely assume that their biopterin is compromised. Now, biopterin has to be recycled and reduced from dihydrobiopterin or BH2. DHFR, or dihydrofolate reductase, is the rate-limiting enzyme to reduce BH2 back into BH4. So methotrexate, for example, is a drug that is a DHFR inhibitor, or maybe they have a SNP or something wrong with their folate pathway where they're not able to effectively reduce and regenerate biopterin to make all of these critical molecules, including nitric oxide. Now, here's where the plot twist comes in a little bit here. One of the most potent stimulators of this pathway that's going to inhibit biopterin bioavailability and increase neopterin, lipopolysaccharide, right? So when we're talking about inflammation, we're talking about leaky gums in a dysbiotic oral microbiome, a leaky gut and dysbiotic gut microbiome, that lipopolysaccharide endotoxin and this endotoxemia effect that we can get from the leaky gums and leaky gut. All of those endotoxins are going to provocate and tick off our macrophages and immune cells. So now we have compromised biopterin, increased neopterin, compromised methylation, compromised nitric oxide. And then further, macrophages and glial cells will produce nitric oxide from inducible nitric oxide synthase to facilitate this inflammatory response. So this LPS stimulating the GPCH1, along with interferon gamma, is another major inducer. So this is all going to drive more oxidative stress and inflammation throughout the body and uncoupling of our endothelial nitric oxide synthase, as well as neuronal nitric oxide synthase. So we have to quiet this down. We have to restore eubiosis to the oral microbiome and gut microbiome. We have to heal the tight junctions, both in the oral cavity, in the gastrointestinal tract, as well as the blood-brain barrier itself. So this is just a simplified diagram for the methylation cycle with the folate pathway, the methylation cycle, transsulfuration for those of you that like the biochemistry here. Now, I want to take this a little bit more in depth and looking in a little bit closer at how homocysteine, this noxious intermediate amino acid with hyperhomocystinemia, and how this homocysteine can cause endothelial dysfunction, inflammation, oxidative stress in the body and the brain. So this is zooming in on the blood-brain barrier, which of course are endothelial cells that express endothelial nitric oxide synthase. Now, we also have NMDA receptors, or N-methyl-D-aspartate receptors, on the blood-brain barrier. And excess homocysteine can bind onto those NMDA receptors and stimulate them. This activates an intracellular pathway known as beta-selectin that then decreases the expression of claudin-5 tight junction proteins. Quite literally, high homocysteine levels can impair the blood-brain barrier and drive that leaky brain phenomenon. Further, that homocysteine can then leak into the parenchyma of the central nervous system, activate NMDA receptors within the central nervous system. So now we have excess glutamatergic activity, hello anxiety, right? And at a high enough degree, this can contribute to excitotoxicity, which can be neurotoxic and contribute to oxidative nitrosative stress and neuroinflammation in the brain as well. So we have to be able to bring down this homocysteine. I will say that the nitric oxide foundation product does have 200 micrograms of methylcobalamin. Now, a lot of MTHFRs might need more than just 200 micrograms, but there is some methylcobalamin within the nitric oxide foundation product for these reasons. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to speed this up a little bit as if I'm not moving fast enough. But nitric oxide within the central nervous system, as I alluded to before, acts as a retrograde, as in it moves backwards across the synaptic cleft. So nitric oxide is released by the postsynaptic neuron. It migrates backwards across the synaptic cleft and modulates the release of our serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, so on and so forth. So nitric oxide is deeply involved with our neurotransmission system and to help with the maturation of neural stem cells so we can develop fully functioning neurons and then integrate those new neurons into our existing neural circuitry, neuroplasticity, how we rewire the brain, how we create long-term potentiation and strengthen neural networks so we can form memories and learn new skills, or dare I even sprinkle in a little esotericism of unlearn faulty self-limiting belief systems and learn new habits and skills that actually propel us closer to our functional healing goals, right? If we're trying to protect the brain and rewire the brain, we need adequate nitric oxide signaling, or also to maintain a healthy blood-brain barrier. Nitric oxide actually regulates the tight junctions of the blood-brain barrier, the intestinal barrier, as well as the barrier within the oral cavity itself. All of these tight junctions are in part regulated by nitric oxide signaling. And the glymphatic system that I mentioned earlier with those aquaporin 4 protein channels that allow water to essentially diffuse from the cerebrospinal fluid into the interstitial fluid of the parenchyma of the central nervous system. So without healthy circulating nitric oxide, which is really based on circulating levels of nitrate, all of this could become dysfunctional. So this is one of my favorite graphics I've ever made. And this really illustrates a lot of what we've talked about so far, where the blood-brain barrier with its endothelial nitric oxide synthase, the glial cells that express inducible nitric oxide synthase, and then the neurons that express the neuronal nitric oxide synthase. So when we have this dysbiotic, endotoxemic leakiness of the oral and gut microbiome, more LPS that are activating our microglial cells and macrophages into that pro-inflammatory N1 phenotype, and this is what's driving inflammation in our tissues, in our brain, that can obviously then damage and cause collateral damage to our brain cells as measured by neurofilament light chain as a good clinical pearl for you all. So here's that neopterin or myeloperoxidase, quinolinic acid, some of these different biomarkers we can use to really objectively know if some of these mechanisms are dysregulated within our patient or client population here. So that's what's so cool about this is nitric oxide is involved in literally all of this, and even the remyelination from our oligodendrocytes to our neurons. So there's a whole multiple sclerosis lesson that we could have. But we can really safely say that the regulation of nitric oxide is critical for maintaining overall health throughout the periphery, throughout the central nervous system, and really everything in between. As we start rounding this out and looking at then the oral microbiome and gut microbiome a little bit closer here, I think a lot of us would agree that gut health and microbiome health is really ground zero. In my line of work, I'm always preaching mindset, metabolism, and microbiome, the three big pillars of mental health in particular. So of course, with this oral microbiota, all sorts of poor oral hygiene practices, such as vaping and smoking, or the chlorhexidine-based mouthwash. How many of your clients and patients are using Listerine every day? That might be decimating their oral microbiota and reducing the ability of the oral microbiome to reduce nitrate into nitrite. So there's actually a lot of research illustrating how poor oral hygiene or Listerine use can directly raise blood pressure and increase the risk of cardiovascular disease because you're killing your oral microbiome that's needed to regulate nitric oxide in blood flow, perfusion, blood pressure, so on and so forth. So at Berkeley, we're so passionate about teaching and sharing the science and information and equipping practitioners with tools to act as solutions for this. So here's a great excerpt from this reference that you can check out, but it talks about some of the major bacterial species that reduce the nitrate and nitrite into nitric oxide, such as Neisseria, Haemophilus, Prevotella, so on and so forth. So these are some of the specific nitrate reducing bacterial species that we want abundant both in our oral cavity as well as our gastrointestinal tract. We're getting ready to release an oral microbiome white paper that I recently wrote, so we'll have that out probably in the coming weeks, and that'll be a great resource if you want more information about the oral microbiome in relation to nitric oxide here. And of course, these days now there's even oral microbiome tests that you could use as well, right? So we actually have some preliminary data that illustrates that chewing one piece of our nitrate gum 2 times per day is able to decrease some of these naughty dysbiotic microbe species in the oral cavity and increase those nitrate reducing. 2 pieces of gum per day for 4 days. So that's why 1 pack of gum has 8 pieces. But this is a therapeutic gum. I've never been much of a gum guy, but now I am. It can be used as an ergogenic aid, a clinical therapeutic, because of that nitrate. So this is where we have this recycling mechanism that I already mapped out for all of you. So whether we're ingesting the Nitric Oxide Foundation capsules or the gum or drinking green juice or eating a big salad, we're able to circulate this nitrate throughout the body and then reduce it as needed into that pleiotropic gas that is nitric oxide. So we have to be making sure that as part of our holistic functional program for our clients and patients, we're educating them on the importance of oral hygiene practices, maybe scratch the fluoride toothpaste and the chlorhexidine-based mouthwash. or even maybe excess oil pulling or some of these antibacterial, products and toothpaste and everything. We don't want to damage our plastic and malleable and hopefully resilient oral microbiome here, because it is such a critical step in being able to reduce the nitrate into nitric oxide. Now, further, as we round this out, I want to make sure I give plenty of time for questions because I have a feeling there might be a few. Nitric oxide, again, is allowing blood flow to the gastrointestinal tract, but also it stimulates our mucosal barrier formation, our mucin 1, mucin 2. It regulates the activity of our immune cells within the enteric nervous system, as well as maintaining a healthy microbiome composition. So you really cannot fully heal the gut without adequate nitric oxide levels to support the tight junctions and the mucosal integrity. And so certainly this is where looking at the role of nitric oxide, as I mentioned before, in regulating those tight junctions and the occludins and claudins, just like in the blood-brain barrier or within the oral cavity as well. And even because of the neurotransmitter modulating effects of nitric oxide, we could have a whole conversation about the vagus nerve and the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. Without adequate nitric oxide signaling, we can't release that acetylcholine that is able to inhibit that pro-inflammatory response from the macrophages that's stimulated by the LPS, right? So there's a lot of ways that we can create sophisticated protocols to work on a lot of these mechanisms rather succinctly and cost effectively. So we talked about the macrophage activation. Now, to round this out, and then we'll wrap it up, we also have to recognize the contributions of nutrients from the microbiota itself. So this paper in particular is more looking at some of these bacterial species within the gut, such as Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium, that are able to synthesize folate, which is the star of the show when we're talking about methylation or biopterin that we've been discussing throughout this presentation. So not only do we need that garden of life for nutrient status, but whole body health to produce adequate short-chain fatty acids and adequate nitric oxide. The microbiome heavily regulates nitric oxide status and signaling. So it brings it all full circle. And no surprise, it turns out that there is an increased prevalence of MTHFR in individuals with IBD. So MTHFR can predispose people to an increased likelihood of developing IBD. And then concomitantly, meta-analysis demonstrates that, hey, maybe supplementing with folate and B12 can have a therapeutic effect in IBD. Right? So nitric oxide is the key molecule that connects methylation to gut health and microbiome status. And I just think it's amazing the innate wisdom of the body. This is a good graphic that just illustrates the gut-brain axis. You can check it out on your own time because I know we're getting a little low on time. This slide encapsulates some of the major mechanisms of nitric oxide for mental and metabolic healthcare. So with that, I want to encourage you all to support healthy nitric oxide, which will allow everything else to work better. So I'll go ahead and pause there so we can have some time for Q&A, and it's an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to share this information with you.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.